All right. So, Eric, this is actually round two for us. We had a fun conversation a couple weeks back. And one of the reasons why I really enjoy interacting with new people online is because I'm increasingly like bullish on finding people that are 4 or 5, even more years younger than me, and learning from them, especially like curious and kind, and people that I would classify as like highly competent, and just like seeing them early on. And then also at the same time, like finding older people who are more experienced in their like 40s and 50s and learning from them. And you definitely fall into that like former camp of you have this newsletter, Generative Value, and you have a very good sense and skill set for being able to like simplify um, ideas that I think would be very complicated, specifically in the like technology space. So maybe just as a setting the stone for people that are listening for the first time, like generative value, what is it, and kind of what's the backstory of how it got started.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much for having me. Generative Value is a tech-focused investment newsletter I write, and it started. I never intended to like make it into an audience or like get any significant number of followers, and I just started writing it because I was spending a lot of time researching companies and stocks in my free time. So I thought might as well publish it online, and I just thought it'd be a good way to organize my thoughts. And I intended to do it completely anonymously. And I didn't even think about on Substack that your name is attached to your newsletter. And so I wrote an article about Databricks. It was maybe my third or fourth article, and I had maybe 16 followers. And then I started getting all these emails about subscribers. And it turns out that Ali Godsi, the CEO of Databricks, shared that article on LinkedIn
Wow.
saying, like, smart guy, some things I agree with, some things I disagree with. And then people started messaging me that I knew, like, hey, is this you? Is this your blog? And I was like, yeah, I guess it is. I guess it's time for me to put my name on this. So that's how it started. It just stemmed from something I'm really passionate about, something I've been doing for a long time. And it got shared kind of by accident. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll take it a little more seriously.
And what was the original motivation for even starting the newsletter in general? Was it more of a personal exercise of like there's ideas that you want to practice articulating in the written form, or like I'm just curious in terms of why you even started?
Yeah, I mean, that's the exact reason I wanted to really articulate my ideas and have them laid out clearly. More of a philosophical view of how I started. I asked myself the question, if I had unlimited money, what would I do every day?
Mm,
And it took me a while to answer that question, but I thought after a while, I love investing and I would genuinely be happy getting up, researching, writing about investing, and then talking about those ideas with other people every day. Like that sounds like a very fulfilling, good life. And so that's why I started. I thought if I would do this with unlimited money, why wouldn't I do it when I have limited money?
yeah.
And so that's why I started. And it's been a really great way to meet people, to structure my ideas, and to learn a lot. Because honestly, like when I was writing it privately and just like putting my thoughts into Google Drive, um, I didn't have the same attention to detail because I didn't think that 1,000 people may be reading this and maybe 10 or 20 of those are going to be dissecting each detail. And so that's kind of how I think about it when I'm writing these. I really want to have my facts straight. Um, and so it's really helped me get an attention to detail with my investing process that wasn't there before.
For the listeners that are not familiar with your work, in terms of like how you'd categorize the newsletter and the types of ideas you talk about and what you write about, like you would bucket them into different categories because some of them are like deep dives. I guess there's like overviews of industries, like whether it's semiconductors or like data centers, and those are really helpful. And then others are like specific investing theses on specific companies. I guess like how would you describe what your newsletter is to those unfamiliar?
Yeah, exactly. So based on the newsletter, I write about what I'm learning about. And that's it. And most of the time that's spent studying companies. When I first started, I spent a lot more time studying companies. Um, in my investing style, for a little bit of background, is very long term. I try to think 20 or 30 years out. What are the things that I can confidently predict and kind of work my way back from there? And so I thought I should think the same way about my learning strategy as I would my investment strategy. And so I kind of took a step back and said, what do I want to be writing about? And I thought about it, and I think it's valuable to study industries before companies. And so that's why I started writing these primers on these industries. And generally, I have a goal to write a primer on each major industry in tech so that I can have a good idea in my mind of how the entire technology ecosystem connects to each other. Because I don't think that each tech vertical can be viewed in isolation. You know, cybersecurity is dependent on the cloud doing well, software doing well. Data is dependent on companies having an increasing amount of data and managing that data. And it's all kind of underlined by hardware and semiconductors and data centers. So that's kind of how I think about what I'm writing. And so recently I've been spending a lot of time studying industries. But I've also spent time studying like the history of tech super cycles, for example. So studying through the history of the mainframe, how we moved to mini computers and then PCs and then the cloud and then mobile. So I just write about what I'm learning about, and I hope that it's valuable to people writing. But admittedly, it's a selfish endeavor how I choose what I'm going to write about.
One of the things that I find incredibly valuable and I appreciate when interacting or working with other people on projects is when they take a lot of time to be thoughtful about compressing ideas into as few words as possible. And I feel like your writing via your newsletter really does that. And the other aspect in terms of communication skill is like using visuals to like effectively transmit ideas. A lot of the pieces that you have published are like coupled with, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 different charts and graphs. Have you always been like good at doing that? Because I haven't come across that many newsletters that do it as effectively as yours. So I'm just curious in terms of how you had acquired that skill set.
Yeah, that is something that's just come about organically because I spent some time, certainly at the beginning, posting a lot on Twitter, and the graphs always did better. Always did better. So at first it
Yeah.
was like, okay, people like these, I'll make more of them. But then as I got deeper into it, I was like, wait, these really help me understand industries better. And so now when I'm writing like an industry primer, for example, it's like the graph is just the mental model of how I think about the industry. So I want to understand the flow of value across an entire industry, and the graph just happens to be the best way for me to think about it. And I think it's also helpful for other people to then understand the industry. And so the graphs, I agree that they they provide such a clear way for people to see data. And you could write a 5,000 word article about one of these industries, and I think it'd be arguably just as valuable as having one graph, which is like
Mm.
a crazy idea to think about. But I think most of the people that read my stuff would agree. Like, I have all the information there, and the like 5,000 words I write about an industry, it's really just like evidence of this is how I think about that one graph.
I think a lot about the reading that I do because I try and make reading a consistent practice for myself. And one of the worries that I always have is that I'm not retaining that much from the content that I'm digesting. And to some extent, that like might be true where even immediately after reading a book, if someone were to ask me what were the 5 or 10 key points that you got from this book, I sometimes struggle to articulate those, like even immediately after writing a book. But when I think about like visuals and even in reading your newsletter in anticipation of this discussion, like I can see the graph of like Azure just like incrementally spiking up quarter over quarter and gaining market share specifically because of the graph that you provided. And like in a similar light, I can see like Nvidia in terms of their dominance in the GPU like semiconductor space continuing to gain market share as well. And there's something unique about visuals that are much easier to recall. And I have been doing this like learning sprint on marketing and advertising, and a lot of it is like what catches people's attention and what makes them stick. And I feel like you've really figured that out with the newsletter. So much respect to you on that front.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but generally, I think that the reason graphs do so well is because it provides a black and white way for people to understand data. And if there's like one thing I wish I could have a watermark on all my graphs that's like there's nuance here. Like
Mm.
there is gray in this chart. Like data, it's not black and white. So the chart is black and white and it tells a very specific message. And I think that's why it's so easy for people to digest. But it's like it's the gray that matters just as much as the black and white data. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it's how I think about it. Of like the nuance is really important, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot. Because as people have started to share my graphs and stuff, they never include the disclaimers that I put under the graphs of like, this is where the data comes from, this is where it may be wrong, this is why, this chart is the trends are correct, but take it with a grain of salt. These articles that people write using my charts, they never include that. And so, yeah, it's something I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how graphs are black and white, but the data itself, like the actual trends, are gray.
Yeah, I mean, even if you were to analogize that to like social media content today and just short form video or video in general, just like how much it's taken off, there's something about maybe the way that the mind processes visual data that like is just so much easier to understand that maybe it's like something primal. But even when I think about the graphs that you put up on your newsletter, like a lot of the times I'm telling myself a story to some extent as to what's happening. And it's easier for me to like digest that story in a visual format as opposed to like reading a couple of paragraphs and then trying to recollect like what those paragraphs were saying. So I wonder to what extent like that's the case as well. And I do feel like visual is just so powerful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's going to be when we think about like AI, I spend a lot of time thinking about AI. It's like right now we're still mostly in text generation. Like there is like photo generation, like there is some video generation, but I wouldn't say it's widespread, and I certainly wouldn't say it's like up to the level of quality that our text generation is. And so when we start to think about like how how easily our brains process images and videos, and we think about the effect that AI can have on that, I think it's going to be one, pretty incredible, and two, pretty scary on how it can change our minds, because it's just like TikTok. Like it's so addicting because like our brains, like having these different stimuli just like fires those neurons on our brain in a different way. And like once AI is able to generate those,
Yeah.
uh, I think it's going to change a lot of. It's just going to continue this trend of our brains being changed by technology.
I think so too. I mean, even with a lot of these new AI technologies that are coming out, it's hard for me to even keep up with the amount of volume. And one of the things that I've seriously been thinking about is even with how I construct or think about this long-term success of like my career is now maybe more than ever, it has been more important to constantly be updating like the operating system that you're using. And when I find like some younger people who are actually using like ChatGPT on a regular basis, I reflect and I think like, wow, I'm still using like Google and just like the basic stuff. And I should probably spend, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 months and allocate specific time to educate myself with like these tools and how to utilize them. Because I think that's the thing that scares me a lot is like we are moving very fast and there's going to be like outsized benefit to people who actually spend the time to learn these new technologies. And I feel like I'm behind. Are you using like any of these tools on a day-to-day basis?
Well, one thing I'll say before I answer that is like don't feel alone, because like Google, the company, is trying to figure out exactly how to like integrate into people's lives so like they protect their monopoly. So that's like one of the wealthiest companies ever to exist, and like
Mm.
they haven't figured out how to easily integrate it into people's lives yet. So like you're not alone. I do um I'm very hesitant to use ChatGPT specifically when it comes to my research, because I want to make sure like I'm hard coding the information I have like in my brain, like make sure I'm really learning it at a foundational level. And if I let ChatGPT synthesize it for me, I think I lose a lot of the value of like the ability to like I think there's a lot of value in reading, thousands and thousands of words of information and then synthesizing it into, 2 or 3 sentences. And that's basically what ChatGPT does. Like that does that work for us.
Hmm.
And so I'm pretty hesitant to use it for like my investment research. Um, with that being said, I do use it constantly for my day to day work, because it just gets answers immediately. Like
Yep.
instead of me scrolling through pages and pages trying to find one thing, it just gets it right away.
Here's the thing though with AI that I'm skeptical of, which is like even the newsletter pieces that you have written, right? Like you are compressing ideas in a way that is very difficult. Right? There's like a lot of work and thought that goes into it. And I think if you look at AI from a very far away, distant approach, it's easy to kind of wave your hand and say like AI is going to be able to do all of this stuff. They're going to be able to write newsletters and stuff like that. But I I am skeptical that like even the work that you have provided via your newsletter is something that's going to be easily replicable by an AI. I'm curious what your perspective is on that. Do you think maybe 5 years from now I could say, hey, spit out a semiconductor summary in the style of Eric, and it would do a very close to, if not better, job?
It might be able to do it now. I think that I think the images are the main things that differentiate my newsletter from like one that an AI could generate.
Mm.
Uh, I mean, I really do think we're not far away from like AI being able to like generate the exact stuff I put on my newsletter, and that's part of the reason why I say like my newsletter is a selfish endeavor because like it helps me learn it much deeper than I would if I read my articles. Like me writing my articles makes me learn it so much better than if I were to read my articles.
Hmm.
So, but no, I think AI can do what I do for the most part when it comes to the newsletter. I don't know that it can think as deeply. I don't know if that makes me any better than it when it comes to investing, but it makes me a little bit smarter than I would be if I used it for my investing.
I'm gonna timestamp our conversation here, and then 5 years later, we're gonna revisit, and then I'm going to try and use some sort of AI technology to replicate some of the work that you've produced. And my suspicion, and I could very well be wrong, is that I'm gonna prefer your work to the AI's work. But I guess only time will tell there.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, I think the interesting conversation there is like, what can't AI replicate? And then the follow up question is like, on what time frame? Because like, if we play this out, Tyler, and we say 100 years from now, what is technology not going to be able to do that humans? What can technology do that humans can't 100 years from now? I mean, can you think of anything? Maybe like make mistakes, like be wrong, fight each other.
Well, I think one of the issues is that we don't have a very good definition for what creativity is, right? Like, even when you talk about intelligence, like, people will talk about this person has a higher working memory than this other person, or this person has greater long-term recallability than the other person, right? It's like there are like these different pieces of intelligence, but there's not like an overarching definition for what it is. And I think that the challenge in like predicting what AI can and can't do 100 years from now is partially due to the fact that like we don't have a good explanation or a good definition for what creativity is. Because if we did have a good definition for what creativity was, then we could somehow, back out of that definition and create a robot that can do it. Like, I think the unpredictability or the undefinability of it is like what makes it so hard to predict. I don't know if I'm making any sense there, but that's that's my general sentiment.
No, I think that does make a lot of sense, and I don't see any like reason any outcome in the reasonably like short term where humans aren't still driving innovation. I think that is like exactly what you were saying. Like our creativity is like the ability to take risks and do things illogically.
Mm.
Like that's the thing that'll take AI. I think a long time to get right is like how to motivate people. And maybe that's not the case. Maybe it can replicate that, but I do think the ability to yeah. I mean, you're right. The creativity piece is so interesting because like, what is creativity? You know?
Yep. Yep. And the other thing is like, what is the human experience? So the thing that comes to mind is like Alex Wachowski, this guy who runs Alex and Books Twitter account. I interviewed him. It was a couple weeks back. But one of the examples that I was trying to give him for why you need to pair action with reading is in Good Will Hunting. There was that scene where the main character was basically being lectured by his therapist, and the therapist, which was played by Robin Williams, was basically saying like, look, you've read all of these books and you're incredibly intelligent, and if I were to ask you questions about what's it like to travel to Asia or what's it like to be in love, you could probably give very good answers based on all the knowledge that you've acquired. But have you actually like experienced those things? Like, do you actually know what it means to be in like a relationship, or do you know what it means to take like serious risks with your career? And he was basically saying like, you're lacking something very real in not being able to experience those things. despite the fact that you could probably fool somebody because you have read all of these texts and spit a very high quality answer back. And to me, it does feel like there is something in terms of the human experience that like AI wouldn't be able to replicate.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're spot on. And I think it does lead, I mean, not that we're only 15 minutes into this conversation, but it does lead to like the very important question of what gives people meaning? You know, what gives humans meaning, the human experience? I think like if you ask that people, I think the question, what would you do if you had unlimited money, really gives a lot of insight into what people think meaning is. But I think that the data may show something otherwise because I think if you ask people, if you had unlimited money, what would you do every day? I think people immediately say like, I'd go travel, I'd go to the beach. But everyone you hear that like goes and travels for 6 months or a year, they're like, I'm exhausted. Like, there's no way I could do this for the rest of my life. Maybe not everyone, but most of the people I talk to that go travel for a few months, back around Europe or Asia, whatever, they say, I can't do this for forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's like the perceived meaning of life. Like, what would people do? But then um, I think when we take a step back from that, I think responsibility is what gives people a lot of meaning in life. And I think a lot of people derive that meaning and that responsibility from their careers. And so then if their careers can be replaced by AI, then it's like that takes out the underlying meaning. So then it's like, is it even possible to have that human experience without the foundational human activities that are kind of like the core? And then the
Yep.
human experience is everything we experience outside of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it brings in another question, which is there's always technology is like a double-edged sword to some extent, is like the people that can harness technology and use it for their benefit, they gain incredible leverage from it and it becomes a huge unlock. But then for another piece of society that maybe is not educated and whose lives are going to be disrupted by technology, it's like, is the net benefit in the long run worth it, right? And it's funny because I had a colleague that I worked with when I was at Goldman a few years back, and he spends his time trading tech stocks all day for like a hedge fund. And recently he had shared a personal piece about like his worry with technology advancing too quickly for society to basically like digest or to adapt to, and his worries around it. As like a somebody who thinks a lot about technology, both from like a in business and investing lens, but then also more so just like a philosophical lens, do you land on one side of the table?
Yeah, I certainly think that like technology is advancing way faster than I don't know about society, but certainly that our brains can handle. I mean, I think social media is the obvious example. I actually spent some time in college researching how like technology affects our mental health, and I think social
Mm.
media is the best example that our brains just are not adapted to experience this level of one stimulation from the technology and two the the exposure that social media gives. I mean, you constantly are seeing so many different things that it's hard to feel like anything you do is unique or meaningful. That may not have answered the question exactly, but I certainly think that we're seeing an incomplete vision of what technology can do. I think if you think of technology as something that's supposed to make our lives better,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that technology is making our individual lives better. I think as a whole, technology is making society better. But I think us as humans having that human experience, I don't think it's necessarily getting better from technology.
Yeah, yeah. I guess this is interesting as well because you lived in the city for a period of time, and then you moved back to. You're from Indiana, right?
Yeah, correct. From Indiana, lived in Chicago after graduation, and moved back to Indiana a few months ago.
From a well-being perspective, like city life is very different than, and you're from like a small town. I know that.
Yeah, and I
Tell
don't
me
live
about.
in a small town now, but I am from like a very small town.
Yeah, was the decision motivated at all by like quality of living, like overall? I what was the decision making process there?
Yeah, a big part of it is just like where my close relationships were. And I certainly think that is, I think the data does show that your close relationships determine in large part your happiness. There's a few other things. Um, so that was certainly one factor. Um, The other factor was I was writing generative value. I started generative value, and I was spending so much time researching it that it's almost like it's like a time machine living in a smaller place. Like in the city, it's like everything takes longer.
Yeah.
If you're going out to dinner, you're gonna have a 20-minute Uber or a 30-minute Uber, and then maybe that's not a good example, but like if you go to the grocery store, it's gonna be a hassle to get to the grocery store in the city, and you got to walk or drive in the city back. Whereas like in a smaller place, it's like 5 minutes to the grocery store, 5 minutes back, and you're in. Um, so certainly it almost felt like a time machine moving back to a smaller place than Chicago, which is a massive city.
Yeah, that makes sense. It is interesting to reflect on like relationships, both in-person relationships and social relationships as well online, because I think that there's both a great advantage and disadvantage to being online, and you've probably experienced this with being on Twitter and the newsletter, which is just the amount of exposure that you can get and the relationships that you can keep up with are like greatly amplified by just being online. But then on the flip side, there's also just so much information that's coming at you from people that you might not know that well. And that information being fed to you on a regular basis in terms of your overall quality of life, I feel like it does oftentimes more damage than it does good. So that's another like aspect of technology and the weird ways in which it's shaping us. That's one thing that I worry a lot about.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you thought about how that'll affect you as your own like personal brand and like podcast scales?
At this point, the podcast and even like my interactions with people online are not large enough to where that's really a problem. But I mean, thinking ahead, I do think that if the podcast scales, that I'm going to have to be more careful about the relationships that I choose to maintain. Specifically because, like, an example of how I felt Twitter to become much more approachable is if somebody follows me and I follow them, just pinging them, having a conversation with them, because as soon as you establish that like personal connection, when they post something online or you post something online, it's so much easier to engage with their content when you know who that person is. Whereas if you're just seeing a profile behind a screen, there is some level of hesitation about like interacting with that person if you haven't established that personal connection. But obviously that approach is like not long-term sustainable, where if right now I've got like 500 followers, then that's viable. But if I have like, 2,000, 3,000 plus, that's just, it doesn't become tenable anymore. So it is something that I should think more about. It's kind of like I'll cross that bridge when I get there type of dynamic. But I don't know. Have you thought about that at all? Because you do have a pretty big following on Twitter, and you have over 1,000 newsletter subscribers. So what's your take there?
Yeah, I've certainly been thinking about it a lot recently. So on the data center primer, I spent some time studying market share based on what other analysts and research firms had done, and then some of those graphs I post on Twitter, and I would see these journalists go and write articles based on those graphs, and that kind of had it hit home for me that like before kind of Twitter didn't really feel like a real place. It's like kind of not real, because like most of it is people that are like sitting behind a screen and like if I have a post that gets 100,000 views and I get like five negative comments, whatever that percentage is, what
Hmm.
0.05% of people are commenting something negative, but it's like still seeing those negative comments. I saw quickly how that can scale. And so if you look at someone, some of these really large accounts, it's like you see 10 or 20 or 30 negative comments on everything they post. And it's like, man, like you've got to either be really strong or just disconnected from why you originally started doing it, which was to share information and to educate people and to connect with people.
Yeah.
And so it's certainly something I've been thinking about, something I don't have the answer to. But I certainly see myself long term spending more time on the newsletter than on Twitter, just because some of the feedback loops are just not positive on Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think that, especially for young people, it's dangerous because I think the more mature you are, the better that you can absorb and make self-discerning decisions around like when and where you should be spending your time online. Whereas if you don't have that level of like development or maturity, it's like very hard to pull yourself out of that cycle. Because I have like younger brothers, and like I would think that like TikTok is probably their most used app, which is like is not great, you know.
Yeah.
And even for myself, when I'm on like YouTube and I can see like YouTube Shorts and like Instagram Reels, like just the gravity that those technologies have is like it's so powerful. It's scary how powerful it is.
It's unbelievable. It's hard to see how it plays out. Like this is the least addicting technology's ever going to be. No,
Yeah.
like I'm heavily bullish on the metaverse, and so it's like for our generation, like I don't know about your parents, but my parents were always like, get off your phone, get off your phone. Like you're spending so much time on your phone. I
Yeah.
very much believe that like we'll talk to the next generation like that with the metaverse. Because I think now, like we think about how addicting TikTok is. Imagine if it can like all encompass like your pane of glass. Like right now, it's like it's one screen. But imagine like if they get these headsets to the point where it really feels like you're stepping into a new world, and you can go and like play games, like in like work, like become the person you want to become in the metaverse. Like what can be more addicting than that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like that's certainly where I think we're going to be, whether it's 10 or 15 or 20 years. And so it's like at that point, I think there'll be some real societal impacts on how we interact with technology that I don't know how they play out.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, even like the Apple Vision Pro is a very, tactile example of that. I haven't tried it, but that stuff it scares me a little bit. Especially as somebody who used to like in high school, I was obsessed with StarCraft 2, and
Mhm.
like my competitive juices were very easy to get amplified just playing that game, and to think about like what's going to be possible over these next couple of years, like playing games within a headset like that. I mean, we talked about how there's something about the visual apparatus that is just
Mhm.
engaging to an extent that like other formats are not. So yeah, it is wild with even the AI developments that are occurring in the technology space. Like, do you follow that pretty closely from like a consumption standpoint, or is it mostly like you're interested in how AI is going to affect like semiconductor industry or the cloud industry? Um, how do you think about AI and track its development?
Yeah, I mean, I really try to focus on what's going to be important over a 5 or 10 year period. So I don't track like specifically like how each new generation of semiconductor performs, like based on like processing power and like memory, how much memory it has, or like new developments and like the models of like how many parameters is it trained on, or on like the smaller models, like how accurate is it getting. Like I don't focus on anything like that, but I spend a lot of time thinking about how is this going to play out over a 5 or 10 year period. Because that's the only way it's digestible for me. I'm a generalist investor, so I'm studying a lot of industries and tech, and it's
Mm-hmm.
the only way it's digestible for me is kind of like putting it into like some broader mental models of like, will this matter in 5 or 10 years?
That
I don't
makes
know if
sense.
that answers the question you were asking.
Yeah, yeah, it does. The generative value, the newsletter and its like development over time. Originally, you had it was being written under a different name, and then like at the end of last year, you had like pivoted it. Maybe not pivoted, but just like
Yeah,
rebranded it.
exactly.
What went into that decision?
Yeah, so it was originally called AI and Tech Investing, and I did not think twice about the name. I mean, I spent maybe 30 seconds on what to name it because I'm very much a believer on like a 0 to 1, like
Yeah.
analysis or paralysis by analysis. Like, I think people spend way too much time thinking about how to do something perfectly instead of just doing it. You
Hmm.
know, like just start the newsletter, just start writing, whatever it is, make the call. Like it's going to be so much more efficient over the long run. So I kind of knew AI and tech investing was a placeholder variable. Um, and as the newsletter grew, as I saw more and more people drawn to it, I thought about what I wanted my brand to be. And one, honestly, AI and tech investing is so on the nose that I like something a little more subtle or clever.
Mm-hmm.
And two, like I am a generalist. I'm not an AI specialist. and I don't want to give the impression that like I know everything about AI, and I also want the freedom to be able to study really whatever I want. And so
Hmm.
I thought generative value is just vague enough where it's like I'm always going to be interested in technology, I'm always going to be interested in investing, that like that can encompass pretty much everything I want to write about, like in that sphere.
Yep.
So that's really how I thought about it. I'm a generalist investor first, and I think that's really where my skills lie. And I'm a tech analyst second, which is like studying the actual technology. And I think I'm okay at that, but I'm not I'm not a spectacular semiconductor analyst or a spectacular, SaaS analyst. So that's really how I thought about it.
That makes sense. Yeah. It seems like maybe if you wanted to maximize audience growth near term, that like keeping that AI branding would maybe benefit you. But kind of
Exactly.
similar to your point, like even with the podcast, I had deliberately titled it the idea exchange, which is like very open ended because I
Yeah.
don't want to be bottlenecked in terms of like the ideas that I can explore. And so like, we're talking about technology and investing, but a week ago I was having a conversation with this guy, Dr. Corey Wilkes, who's a psychologist, and I want to be able to have that level of freedom. I think that there is maybe a dangerous aspect to people building like personal brands, which is that if they pigeonhole themselves into something that they actually can't spend their entire lives doing, then it becomes more of a burden and a job than it is like an enjoyable way to live. Much respect for kind of calling that out and pivoting the newsletter there.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. It's also a very different mindset doing it for a living versus doing it as something that like you're passionate about. Like if I had to, I think the newsletter would be significantly worse if I had to make money from it for a living. Like I
Mm.
can't imagine the pressure it would take to know that I have to put out a great post every week, or else like I don't make my salary that month. Like
Yeah.
that would be too much pressure. I think it would be horrible. So I think the mindset is totally different when you're doing something for a living than when you're doing something just because you love to do it.
Yeah, even with the topics that you talk about, like what does the research process look like? So it's like you pick semiconductors as an area of interest that you want to write about. Like what went into that? Like how long did it take roughly, and like what was the research process like?
Yeah. So all of these articles they all follow a similar process. One, it starts with an idea that this will be an interesting industry and it will have potential for investment. That's generally like the um, criteria to start it. But then I start out by reading as broadly as I can. And so I'll read a lot of annual reports from like semiconductor companies. I'll watch YouTube videos on semiconductors. I'll read books on semiconductors. I'll listen to podcasts on it. So it's like there's this intense, like maybe it's a week long, maybe it's 2 weeks of like digesting as much information as I can till like my head literally hurts. Like I'll literally just fall asleep exhausted because I've spent so much time like consuming this information. And I do that until I get to the point where I feel confident segmenting out the general flow of the industry. So generally the major segments of the industry. So like the graphics, I'm sure if anyone like that reads my newsletter is listening to this, they'll see like my graphics. I never put the companies in like when I first start, but I have like the big like white boxes that have like generally the categories of an industry. So
Hmm.
it's like I just consume information until I can get to the point where I understand broadly how the industry is structured. And then I'll go back into like research and I do it for each of the segments. So I kind of like deep dive on each segment in the industry until I get to the point where I could like vocally explain each segment of the industry out loud. And like it may sound crazy, but like when I'm driving or like if I'm going for a walk and there's no one around because I don't want people to think I'm crazy. I will
Yeah.
like vocalize it. I will say like this
Hmm.
is what I will like say it out loud until I can get to the point where I can say that about each of the segments in the industry, where I can like say it and sound reasonably intelligent talking about it. Um, and then from there, then I start really writing the article. So then I start kind of abstracting everything. And like you said, I spend a lot of time trying to simplify it to be digestible because I think, yeah, personally for me, I think it is it's the right thing to do. Like you don't earn anything extra by making it complex. By like using a more complex term, like I just don't see the value in that. So I try to use as simple of a term as I can. So I'll write like the rough draft, and then when I write the rough draft, I see what I don't know that well again, and I'll study that more. And so I just study it until I feel like I have a really like confident understanding of a fundamental like view of the industry. So it's like I think first principles is an overused term, but that's certainly how I like think about my research. And
Yeah,
then it takes
I
probably another week to like finalize everything, to like finalize the images and like finalize, like read it 3 or 4 times to like make sure like I've got my facts straight.
Makes sense. Yeah, I've been doing a learning sprint, is what I call them, where I'll just like compile 10 to 15 books on a specific topic that I feel like I'm like not competent in. And
Yeah.
for the past like 3 or 4 months, I have been reading books on marketing and advertising, and I found that to be incredibly valuable. But then like more recently, I have been trying to summarize and like put in as concise terms as possible the key insights that I learned, and it is like so much harder to engage in that process than it is to just like read and digest the books and then go on to the next book and think like, yeah, I have these down. So part of the reason why I like doing the podcast is because it forces me to articulate ideas and then kind of is like a reality check on whether or not I actually understood something. But writing has a way of doing that. That speaking, you can kind of get over things quickly if you just say them quickly and you sound confident. But writing is a different game, so it's a lot tougher.
Yeah, I mean, doing both of them, I feel like is so valuable. Like, like saying some things out loud. Like, he's probably happened a few times in this podcast. Like, we'll start exploring an idea, or like I will, and then
Hmm.
as I get into it, I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. I'm
Yeah,
gonna stop saying that.
100%. The newsletter in terms of like what surprised you, because I guess in terms of like serendipity, right? And you had like a few tweets that blew up, and you had an influx of subscribers from even like the encounter that you mentioned earlier of like the CEO, was it the CEO of Databricks had
Yeah.
shared it. Um,
Hmm.
what have you like learned, or what has been surprising about just like publishing online? And what would you advise others if they're trying to grow an audience to some extent, maybe like not make a living off of it, but people want visibility on the work that they're doing if they think it's high quality work. I'm curious about your overall experience and advice there.
Yeah, for sure. So one, the things that have surprised me are like how many people reach out through the newsletter. So like genuinely, I've met a lot of people that just reach out, and they're like very like accomplished people that like really shouldn't be reaching out to, a 23 or 24-year old. Like
Yeah.
if the newsletter isn't there, and so that's I've been surprised at how good of a tool it's been for like meeting like other investors or like founders of companies. So like I wrote a primer in the data industry. Like a few founders of data companies reached out and were like, "Hey, this was really good. Like, I do something in this specific niche of data. Like, I'd love to talk to you about it, just so like you're aware or whatever." And so that's been really surprising of just how incredible of a tool it is to meet people.
Hmm.
Um, what advice I'd give for someone trying to grow an audience? I would say one, really try to think through why you want to build an audience. And I don't know that I have a good answer for that for me personally. It's like
Yeah.
I genuinely love investing. I love talking about it. I love researching it. And it's like that's a good enough reason for me. Um, but I think, that passion is a good reason for someone to start. But I don't know if that passion is a good enough reason to try to build an audience. So one, like figure out why you want to do it. Two, if you really do want to build an audience, like like you want to build a business out of it or whatever it may be, find something that draws people in. So it's like in investing, make investing infographics. Like learn how to do that. Like I had never learned how to use Canva before I started making those graphs. Like you just got to learn how to do that stuff.
Yep.
I don't know if I'd have any advice outside of like the investing field. I have no idea. Like a psychology, like personal brand, I have no idea how you could do that. Like that'd be so competitive. It'd be so hard. I think you'd have to have some sort of huge credibility statement. PhD in psychology from Stanford, or psychologist for 20 years, or something like that.
Yep.
So yeah, I think my advice is probably pretty limited to like people specifically trying to build an audience in investing.
With the introduction of your newsletter to other people, like the first time they even hear about you, is there a primary funnel? Like, do you think that most people are coming across you via Twitter and like you posting there? Is it like through Substack and how they recommend it, or is it like somebody big stumbles upon your newsletter and shares it? All of the above, or is there like a few dominant ways that discoverability has like unlocked the newsletter's success?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, one, I'll say it's not like I'm a huge like success from a newsletter.
Well,
So
to be
I
fair, you've
certainly,
been doing it for what? Is it less than a year at this point? And you've only
yeah,
produced
I
what?
maybe started. I think I started in April of last year, so ten months or so.
Yeah,
Um,
which is
and
pretty crazy.
so I would. It has grown. I never had any goals for how it would grow. I thought maybe I could get to a couple hundred followers in a year. I just never thought about it that way. Um, can you remind me of the question here?
How
I
do
got
most
distracted.
people stumble across your newsletter
Oh,
in the
yeah,
first
yeah,
place?
yeah.
That just like haven't heard of you or not existing subscribers.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I have a few thousand followers on Twitter, but it hasn't been that good of a way to move people over to Substack, which is
Mm.
interesting. Like moving across platforms is really hard. And so I think most of the followers probably come from like the subs. So secondly, I'm going to say most of the people come from like the Substack network. I think number one is just organic people sharing the articles. That's like the most. That's the biggest way people find it is just like literally like sharing it like with a friend. So I think direct shares is the number one way, and so that's just like the real answer to like that question is like the only thing that really matters for your newsletter's growth is quality. Like I do believe that. I think that my newsletter following has grown as my articles have gotten better. And so consistency matters, but like the level of quality, I think that should be the main focus for anyone trying to build a newsletter is like your focus should just be on quality. Like make it as valuable as possible. Do not try to do too much quantity. That's what I would say immediately. Like a lot
Mm.
of people post like 3 or 4 times a week. I think that's the wrong path. Like focus on being so even if it's once every 3 months, like make the article so good that people are willing to share it. And that also makes it also every time you write a new article that's better than the last, it resets your bar of execution. So like even my I wrote the semiconductor article maybe 4 months ago and I've left it up because it's done pretty well, but I go back and read it and I'm like, ooh, that's not good, you
Mm.
know? And so it's like I even like the Databricks article, I keep it up because it's cool that like the CEO shared it. But like I go back and read it, I'm like, this is not a good article. Like this is not very good.
Mm.
So that was kind of a long and winded answer to the question.
Does it ever feel unusual or like do you have imposter syndrome at points of like you're 23, 24 years old and you're doing like primers on these industries and some like very intelligent people are reading your content? Was it weird at all at first when you first were jumping in, or did you feel like you had like a pretty good footing to and credibility to to actually explain some of these ideas?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of imposter syndrome with it, and it's actually interesting. So when I first started, I was doing it because like I just found it interesting. Like I was just writing my thoughts and what I found interesting. As I've gotten more followers, I think I've become much more humble with it. So I try to start like every article with like I'm not an expert. Like
Yep.
this is a 0 to 1 effort to me. So like I'm writing a cybersecurity article right now. I've never really studied cybersecurity before, and so it's like morally I'm torn like should I even be writing stuff that like that I've never studied before, but
Yeah.
then it's also like at the same time it's like maybe that's what's most valuable to people that haven't studied before. So
Yep.
like am I going to write a cybersecurity primer that's going to provide value to an expert in cybersecurity? No way, 0% chance, except maybe the image would be helpful for him. But like for
Yeah.
someone that like hasn't studied the industry before, it's like yeah, that may be valuable. And I think it's just one of those things that like I've got to eat, you know? You just have to take it because like if you want to wait until you're an expert in something, like you're going to wait 5 or 10 years. Um, and I think there's some merits to that, but it's not the path I've chosen.
One of the issues that I find, or at least that I found when I was in university, was that a lot of professors who were incredibly intelligent had a very difficult time explaining simple concepts to their students. And I think part of it was because they assumed that their students like understood some like complex ideas when they didn't. And
Mhm.
they took for granted how much they knew and how much the students didn't. And there's always like that life advice of like if you are going to try and achieve some success in any endeavor, it's best to look at somebody that's like a couple of years ahead of you rather than somebody who's 10, 20, 30 years ahead that has already made it, because that person that has already achieved success, they don't remember what it was like to be in your shoes. And I feel like it's maybe a similar thing for you in the writing that you're doing. Like, as somebody who knew little to nothing about the semiconductor industry or little to nothing about like data centers, I found it super valuable and very digestible to read your content. Whereas maybe if I was trying to digest an industry summary from somebody that's actually an expert in the field, I would have found it less valuable. So to some extent, I think that you're dead on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly right. I also think that I think as you get into the details of something, it's hard to know if you actually understand it. You know, like because I think the real like sign of showing understanding is being able to simplify it, like being able to consolidate it like into such a small amount that someone like would hear it and be like, that guy is like that he can say it, he can summarize an industry in one sentence. He has no idea what he's talking about. When in like reality, it's the exact opposite.
Yeah, yeah. No, I totally agree. I know we are going to be coming up on time here soon. Two things. One, feel free to like plug the newsletter and like where people can find you on Twitter. And two, which is just like an offer, is as you are maybe working on interesting topics or ideas throughout the year and anticipating like publishing pieces, if you want to use like the podcast as an opportunity to explore some of those ideas or practice like articulating them in the spoken word, would love to have more conversations around that.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think that would be a ton of fun. If you want to find the newsletter, it's Generative Value. I can't promise it will provide value, but hopefully it may provide a little, or at least provide some graphics to look at. But yeah, man, would love to come back on the podcast.
Awesome, Eric. Thanks for doing it. Found your work incredibly like worthwhile and worth sharing as well. So I'm excited to see what's to come in 2024.
Yeah, thanks so much, man.